A word is simply a sound with a socially attached meaning. It's a verbal sign which, for wrong or right, culturally we agree points to some aspect of the real world. Without a definition, a word is simply a sound. Using arguments from George Smith's Atheism: The Case Against God, I will show how the word God is either completely devoid of definition or contains only an incoherent definition, ultimately leaving us with a noise. Granted, it's a noise that a lot of people are fond of, but it's just a noise nonetheless. In order for a sound to become a word, it must be defined. However, in human language, to assign an attribute to something is to limit it. Something which possesses quality X cannot, at the same time and in the same respect, possess qualities which are not X. For example, if something is said to be visible, it cannot coherently be said to also be at the same time and at the same respect invisible. Theists desire to have a deity that is unrestricted in any way. This is the reason they will never be able to coherently define God. To deny the properties of a being is to deny the being itself. To talk about the properties of a being which necessarily has no properties can only be incoherent. Theists try to escape the incoherence of the word God via two methods. One is to ascribe negative qualities to their deity. For example, it's invisible, that is to say it's not visible, or it's formless, that is to say it's without form. These tell us what God is not what God is. But a being which can only be described in negations cannot be distinguishable from non-existence. So at some point a positive quality must be ascribed to God. Some theists try to do this, but they are assured failure. For example, God is regularly said to love, but God could not possibly love as humans do, that is, with emotions and expressions which express themselves in the limited finite bodies of humans. The same is true of all other positive characteristics in the human language which necessarily entail a material presence. At best, God's love can be interpreted as a metaphor. Theists may argue that in the same way we say that a dog's loyalty is to dogs as a human's loyalty is to humans, we can say that God's love is to God as humans' love is to humans. This is flawed for two reasons. Firstly, God is not Superman. God does not merely possess human attributes to an incredible degree because human attributes are limited. Human power is limited, human knowledge is limited, human compassion is limited. Magnifying the quantities of these attributes would only expand the limits, it would not erase them. For example, part of human intelligence is the ability to absorb new knowledge, but God is omniscient, so by definition he could never absorb new knowledge. His intelligence must then not simply be a different degree of knowledge or intelligence, but a completely different kind. So God intelligence, or God knowledge, if you will. Also, without some literal knowledge of God, analogies about God are useless. We might just as well claim that God is yellow or slimy, while stipulating, of course, that these qualities do not mean the same when applied to God as when applied to man, and that God possesses them in a mode appropriate to his infinite nature. Another popular method that theists use to hold on to their pet noise is to assign it to some aspect of the natural universe, or the universe itself. But this is dishonest. The defining feature of theism is a belief in a supernatural being. Declaring the universe, a planet, a continent, a building, an emotion, a person's thought pattern, the sound of children laughing, white doves, a sunset, an orgasm, a particular sensation, a type of animal, a river, a mountain, or any other already defined part of the universe as God is misleading. It might make a nice poetic metaphor, but it's inaccurate. The conflict between atheists and theists is over a supernatural being, not whether a person experienced something with enough personal significance that they feel personally justified in declaring it God. Saying that God exists because the universe exists is only marginally less ludicrous than saying God exists because my tooth decay exists. When you finally get a theist to admit that their deity is not just unlikely, but a complete rational and linguistic contradiction, without abandoning their beliefs, the theist has no choice but to attack language and reason. Ineffable means something which cannot be described. You cannot describe that which cannot be described. If you were describing it, that's not what we're describing with the word ineffable. God is definitely one of those things which is ineffable, but this does not have the result which theists think it does, because while we cannot rule out the possibility that there are things which exist which we cannot express, we can rule out the possibility that an incoherent expression will ever point to something which exists, or describe something which exists. As I earlier said, a word is a sound which purports to signify, or, in other words, point to some aspect of the real world. A coherent statement is like an arrow. You can point it in different directions. Sometimes it may not be pointing at what you think it is, or what you're trying to point to may not exist, but at least a coherent statement is capable of gesturing. But an incoherent statement points nowhere. If using a coherent statement is like using an arrow, an incoherent statement is like trying to use a circle as an arrow. A circle can never point in a direction, and likewise, by its very nature, an incoherent statement cannot indicate anything, whether it be true or false. Assigning the name God has the effect of implying something greater than what the term actually means. Even many people who know that the term God is completely empty, when they try to picture God, will not draw a blank, but will default to the image of an old white man up in the clouds with magical powers, because that's the image that we have been socially conditioned to picture when we think of God. However, ask any respectable theist whether their God is literally an old white man up in the clouds with magical powers, and they will tell you that this bears no resemblance to what they are actually worshipping. And it couldn't bear any resemblance to what they are worshipping, because what they are worshipping is an incoherent noise. But just so long as there is an image that's generally positive, but also potentially threatening, it doesn't really matter what we imagine when we hear the noise God. Except to try and imbue the term ineffable with a greater meaning than it actually possesses, there is no reason to assign the ineffable the name God over any other noise you could care to make. You could just as validly assign it the name quack, woof, or shlubaloo.